On behalf of the National Center for the Study of Civil Rights and African American Culture at Alabama State University, I would like to welcome you to this very special program honoring the 60th anniversary of the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. In celebration of this historic milestone, our center has convened a distinguished group of speakers who include lawmakers, scholars, public servants, and our own university president, Dr. Quinton Ross. These presenters will speak to us on the enduring legacy of the Voting Rights Act and its importance today as we seek to preserve the right to vote as the cornerstone of our democracy. The National Center has as its mission to serve as a research center and repository of information for the study of civil rights and African American culture at Alabama State University, the university at the heart of the modern civil rights movement. Again, welcome. Thank you for joining us on this very important discussion on the state of the Voting Rights Act 60 years later.
It was a Sunday afternoon in Selma, Alabama, March 7th, 1965. A 25-year-old activist named John Lewis led more than 600 brave souls across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, their steps fueled by courage and a call for justice. But what awaited them was a wall of state troopers, armed not with dialogue, but with batons, dogs, and tear gas. The violence that followed would etch itself into the soul of a nation. Broadcast live into American homes, the brutality of Bloody Sunday shocked the conscience of a nation and awakened a movement. Feeling the weight of public pressure, President Lyndon B. Johnson addressed Congress and called for the passage of a voting rights bill. On August 6, 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed into law one of the most transformative pieces of civil rights legislation in American history, the Voting Rights Act. 60 years later, we reflect not only on the past, but the future. What have we gained? What remains at risk? And how must we continue to protect the right to vote? This is the State of Voting Rights Act. 60 years later, a journey through history, law, and the ongoing fight for access, equity, and the sacred power of the vote. To understand where we stand today, we must first understand where we've been. As a Montgomery native, legal scholar, and vice president of the Brennan Center for Justice, Dr. Kareem Crayton brings a unique perspective to the legacy and future of the Voting Rights Act. With deep roots in Alabama and decades of national experience in law, policy, and redistricting, Crayton helps us frame the historical context and present challenges shaping the fight for fair and free elections, especially here in the American South.
This year marks the 60th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, a seminal part of the civil rights pantheon of legislation that made real the rights of American citizens, including African Americans, to exercise their right to vote throughout the country, but particularly in the southern states. The march that led to the legislation getting top priority in Washington was in Selma. Dallas County, where Selma is located, obviously, was chosen really to highlight the problem of underrepresentation and disenfranchisement. Less than 5% of a majority black county could register to vote, and it was obvious there that changing the policy would give political power to people who were entitled to it. A majority of people in any democracy should be able to have their will met. Unfortunately, the people who marched across that bridge in 1965 were initially met with armed force from a state government that was basically committed, entrenched to deny them their ability to participate. And what Americans saw on their television screens was the evidence of what indifference to this issue had led to, that was armed force used against American citizens who were demanding nothing more than what the Constitution promised. The signing of that document, the bill that passed Congress only a few months after that moment, Bloody Sunday, marked a triumph in many ways for the civil rights movement. A lot of grassroots organizing had occurred in Selma and other places throughout the South, and this really represented Washington's ability to finally get over its institutional barriers, primarily the Southern filibuster, to get this legislation adopted. And by all accounts, even people who didn't like the Voting Rights Act, it made a fundamental difference and did so quickly. The number of African Americans voting skyrocketed, and that had a consummate change on the number of people representing African American interests in state legislatures, city governments, even in Congress. And that has a lasting change. If you think about the growth of the Congressional Black Caucus, for example, it is at record highs. It could not have become that were it not for the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And with that, of course, all of the votes and the interests that are representing African American political aspirations as well. The same can be said for language minorities, as they're referred to in the Voting Rights Act. Latinos, African American voters, as well as Asian American voters, are all groups that have benefited because of the use and the enforcement of that act. It has made a fundamental difference, and at least from its origins, it had always been committed as a bipartisan triumph. Democrats and Republicans agreed across party lines to get this adopted. And in my view, as a native of Alabama, the most significant evidence that that remained an important part of the American sort of, as some people talked about it, the inheritance that we have, is that in the commemorations every year, John Lewis, when he was alive, would bring a whole cadre of people from Washington and around the country. But you wouldn't know whether they were Democrat or Republican unless you watched C-SPAN, because they all showed up holding hands and committing themselves to making sure that this act continued to be enforced. Every time it was renewed, it had joint commitment by Democrats and Republicans. And in fact, in the early to mid-2000s, when it was passed by Congress, George W. Bush was the president, and both houses of Congress were controlled by Republicans. The sad part of what we now see is that no longer in Selma do we see large numbers of Democrats and Republicans holding hands. Only Democrats show up. We don't really see a commitment about the Voting Rights Act embraced as a seminal part of the American legal foundation. We are now instead see attacks on the Voting Rights Act by states and now, frankly, by the federal government, raising questions about whether or not it even had constitutional legitimacy as a tool of enforcement. We're seeing even more insidious uses of attacks on the Voting Rights Act that are saying, well, maybe it's okay, but we can use legal rules to limit who can bring these claims. And we're limiting the ability of individual voters, always the key to what voting is, individuals. We're limiting their ability to bring claims to federal court to say that they're being discriminated against, which leaves only the Department of Justice to be able to bring these claims. All these attacks really nip at the ability of the act to do its work. And what it means in practice is all of that progress that we've seen since 1965 is under attack.
As we reflect on the legacy of Selma and the triumphs of the past, we turn now to a leader who continues that legacy in the halls of Congress. Congresswoman Terri Sewell, daughter of Selma and the first Black woman to represent Alabama in Washington, has become one of the nation's fiercest champions for voting rights. Through the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, she's working to restore the protections once secured in 1965, ensuring that every voice in every community still counts.
That act would fully restore the protections of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was gutted by the Shelby versus Holder decision in 2013. In fact, had that Shelby decision not been decided in 2013, we would still be living under a 25-year reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Why was the Voting Rights Act so important? Well, it was very important because it determined that there were 16 jurisdictions that had a history of voter discrimination, and all 16 of those jurisdictions had to pre-clear any voting laws that were passed by that state, including the congressional maps. And so that prophylactic effort that they had to pre-approve any law before it became law gave us a chance really to make sure that the laws from these 16 jurisdictions was not voter suppression. And it gave us a chance to stop it in its tracks before it became law. By striking down that section of the Voting Rights Act, the Supreme Court basically said that Congress should have used a more modern day formula, that we were punishing by having the same jurisdictions that were chosen in 1965 for the 2006 reauthorization, that we were punishing these jurisdictions when surely things are much better because in 2013, Barack Obama was president of the United States. They were making a broad assumption. You and I both know that so many of those states that required preclearance still had modern day forms of voter discrimination. And so, but without preclearance, the only recourse we have is to sue after the fact, Section 2, for voter discrimination and voter dilution. So the Voting Rights Act is still alive and well. In fact, thank God it's still alive and well. It was reaffirmed in the Milligan case where the Supreme Court told the state of Alabama that they had to draw a second majority minority district or opportunity district. And I was able to get Congressman Shomari Figures to join me as a part of Alabama's delegation, making us the first time ever in the history of Alabama there were two African Americans serving at the same time. So, you know, the same court that took away the preclearance provision in 2013, in 2004, they actually did a good thing and voted in favor of the Milligan decision, which reaffirmed that the Voting Rights Act is still alive and well, or at least the provision, Section 2, is still alive. So I have been carrying the seminal piece of legislation, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, since 2013 in every successive Congress. So every 2 years I filed it, and every 2 years we have sought to get it passed. And we renamed it upon the death of John Lewis in 2019. We renamed it the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And so I'm honored every Congress to carry the seminal piece of legislation as its key sponsor. And every Congress, every single Democrat in the Democratic caucus votes for this bill. In fact, when we were in charge, when the Democrats were in charge in 2021, we passed the bill passed out of the House of Representatives. And that was a really great moment. In fact, we were all just very, 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 very excited about that. But it went over to the Senate side and it died on the Senate side. Why? On the House of Representatives side, all we needed was a simple majority vote. On the Senate side, they have something called the filibuster rule, which requires 60 senators to agree to put any legislation up for a vote. So even though the vote could be a majority, you have to have 60 votes in order to put a bill up for a vote on the Senate side. That filibuster rule is an archaic rule that came out of Jim Crow segregation. So many of us felt very strongly that the Democrats who were in charge of the Senate at the time should have changed that rule, at least for democratic laws that have to do with our democracy, like voting laws. Unfortunately, the Senate majority leader did not see it the same way. And so the filibuster is still alive and well. What's really puzzling for me is the fact that voting rights used to be truly bipartisan, and the Voting Rights Act of '65 was reauthorized 5 times and still would be law today had it not been for the Shelby versus Holder decision. But why is the Voting Rights Act so important? It's important because what we saw right after the Shelby versus Holder decision, we saw states across this nation pass more voter suppressive laws. They could do so because they knew that the Justice Department didn't have to pre-clear them for those states that had been egregious in the past. And so we saw over, state legislature after state legislature pass more voter discriminatory suppressive laws, including our own state of Alabama. where most recently they passed a law in the state legislature that criminalizes absentee ballots. They now say that make it harder for those of us to help the disabled and seniors fill out absentee ballots and criminalizing absentee balloting. And that particular law would have had to been pre-cleared back in the day by the Justice Department before it became law. Now, without any supervision, without any federal oversight, states can run amok, and that's what they've done. Not just southern states. We also saw the state of South Dakota impose a new state law that in order to register to vote, you had to have a physical address, knowing that in Indian country, they only had P.O. boxes. They made it harder for Native Americans to vote. So it's not just a Southern thing. Why is it important for us to have it? I believe that every American should have an equal access to the ballot box, that everyone's vote should count, and that people should know that their vote counts. So I think that the Voting Rights Act, the genius of the Voting Rights Act, was that it stopped a lot of the pervasive voter discrimination that was happening at the state level before it became law. And now, without federal oversight, states can do what they want to do.
From the Selma streets to the halls of Congress, the fight for voting rights continues across generations. U.S. Representative Shomari Figures carries the legacy forward, not only as Alabama's voice in the 2nd Congressional District, but as the son of civil rights champions.
I definitely think there's a need for stronger and more effective voting rights legislation. The John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Act, introduced by Congresswoman Terri Sewell, I think is a step in that right direction, but I think my case, or the district rather, the case that formed the district that I have the privilege of representing now, I think clearly illustrates that there's still very much so a problem, and there's still very much so a significant need for solutions to prevent states and jurisdictions from doing what happened in this case. And so there's still very much so a strong need for it.
Congressman Figures reflects on the spirit that guides his service, honoring the known and unknown foot soldiers who made his path possible.
Look, I think it's more of the spirit that I learned from my parents and people and organizations and groups and foot soldiers of people who came before me. It's that spirit of fight, that spirit of doing what's right, that spirit of standing up for what this country should be for all people. And that's something that I take with me every single day, something that I've taken with me throughout my career. I am fully aware of the fact that I would not have my career absent the impact and the influence of people like my parents and other organizations and groups across the state and across this country, both names that are known and unknown. I think it's a tough environment right now to expect voting rights legislation to come through the halls of Congress right now. However, I am encouraged by the fact that we have seen this iteration of the Supreme Court stand up for the Voting Rights Act, for the remaining provisions in the Voting Rights Act, which allow for the creation of the district that I represent. That gives me hope that people certainly on both sides of the ideological aisle see the need for it and see the problem and see the ways that we have to address it and the ways that we should be addressing it.
While the battle for voting rights continues in Washington, progress is also being forged right here in Alabama. State Senator Kirk of Montgomery is leading the charge with SB 7, the Alabama Voting Rights Act. With provisions that restore rights, expand access to absentee voting, and increase transparency, Senator Hatcher is working to bring meaningful reform to the state level, ensuring every Alabamian has an equal voice at the ballot box.
So the strategy was to be able to put together a bill that would deal with what happened in the aftermath of Shelby versus Holder. At the heart of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was, of course, is the government's responsibility to protect voting rights in this country. And of course, with the pre-clearance piece that was so important in terms of speaking to the various jurisdictions that were, without a doubt, problematic, for lack of a better way of putting that, and prejudicial towards definitely potential Black voter population. It was important for the pre-clearance, piece to be dealt with because it would help us to recognize, so for example, the things that would happen in various states that were hostile towards Black voter participation. And so that's just one piece of that. And so the removal of pre-clearance and declaring pre-clearance unconstitutional really did, in significant ways, it neutered the spirit of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and put us in position for the next piece that would be problematic, which is voter suppression. Because what ended up happening is, it offered into the space of the electorate these laws that would translate into, whether we're talking about voter ID laws or early voting being visited with, and in many instances, that opportunity canceled or viewed with some degree of scrutiny of some sort, as if people were doing things illegally. And then, of course, the other piece of that, would be the closure of polling places, primarily in minority communities, more particularly within the Black community. So when we talk about, the effects of what happened in Shelby versus Holder, again, definitely Section 2, but also Section 5, rather, but also Section 2. Which I think speaks to some of the things I just mentioned. So it's important, what happened in 2013 definitely set us back because Congress has made no move to do anything with addressing the formula that was so necessary and that is still so necessary to be passed. It is still the John Lewis legislation, I think, that is before Congress at this time that seeks to address and revise, improve the formula that, of course, the Roberts Court claims is archaic in a post-racial America. If voting participation was not so incredibly important in our democracy, then you would not have individuals seeking at every turn to suppress it. I would like to believe that there are people across both of our major political parties interested in being able to put together a process of voting in this country that is truly representative of this democracy, that this version of which we export around the world. We should have the kind of election process in this country that should be the envy of the world and every democratic government. Unfortunately, because there are so many things at stake, and I hate to use empty language like that, so many things, we can see even with the current administration and some of what's happening right now in the Texas state legislature, that there are individuals whose entire motivation is to gerrymander these districts so that they can maintain power. So I'm not sure. I'm hopeful that somehow or the other we can have the kind of honest, consistent dialogue around how we can improve the election process. I hope that a bill like the bill that I'm sponsoring in our state Senate here in Alabama with my colleague in the House, Representative Adline Clark, that it would be the kind of legislation that would invite, robust participation from our friends across the aisle in the Republican Party. That remains to be seen because the bill that we're talking about, which again was styled as SB 7, Senate Bill 7, that would have been in the previous legislative session, did not receive committee hearing. So, again, I'm hopeful, but it's very practical in terms of what we're dealing with, because we are yet, as an individual once says, yet fighting for the soul of a nation that's struggling to be born. We're seeing it in every interaction we have. So, yes, I'm hopeful.
We're going to march to the polls. I have to tell you, that is a 4-term state senator. Alabama State University elected me to 4 terms in the Alabama State Senate.
Beyond the courthouse and the Capitol, another critical front in the voting rights conversation lies within our institutions of higher learning. Dr. Quinton T. Ross Jr., a former state senator and now president of Alabama State University, stands at the intersection of policy and education.
It gives me an opportunity to look at how policy is made and how the policy has impacted the overall governing structure, not only of the state of Alabama, but at the nation at large. And so that perspective helps me understand how to approach various issues in the legislature, but it also empowers me to share with others the need to continuously fight for strong voter rights legislation, be an advocate for individuals to raise their voices to their elected officials to make change and impact change, not only locally, but the state and in the nation.
As a proud alum and son of the movement, Dr. Ross reflects on ASU's historic role in the fight for voting rights and its ongoing responsibility to educate, empower, and inspire the next generation of civic leaders.
All of our universities, Alabama State University included, are what I call our learning laboratories. And so we play a very significant role in ensuring that students understand what it is to have their voices heard, how they go about doing it, breaking down the reason and for voter rights legislation and the need to make sure that it's strengthened so that their voices can be heard still today. We want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to participate in government, as well as to be able to elect those individuals of their choice through proper voter rights legislation. By us being a storied campus, a historical campus that was thoroughly immersed in voting rights, I think it's important that the university strengthens that to ensure that students, when they leave here, they understand the importance of voter rights legislation and their need to be involved in the process. Well, they say that sometimes history repeats itself, and so if we're not careful, we will see a decline in individuals really taking the voting rights serious, and we're not being involved in this process. And so we can't let that happen. We have to make sure that we continue to put voting rights at the forefront, encouraging individuals to be a part of this process, letting them know that their vote does count on all levels, so that it can impact the way that we live, impact the society in which we live in, and make a difference in the lives of all of those who seek to come to the United States. Well, we're in a situation right now where things are happening on the federal level with higher ed, and if we're not careful, if we don't have the advocacy, if we don't have elect people who are supportive of our issues, we can see a great decline in the support for higher ed. But luckily, even now, whether it be Republican or Democrat, right? We have those who have been elected that understand the importance of higher education. And so that is what has been beneficial to us, particularly even in these trying times. There's a great need for the faculty, staff, student body to play a role in voting rights legislation, voting rights policy. I think when my parents were in school, of course, that was the pinnacle of individuals receiving the right to vote. And I think that we have to continue that history. And I think through faculty, through staff, through the teaching, even through entities like the National Center, we have to keep reminding our students, the greater community, the importance of voting rights and what it means for our democracy.
In terms of the future of this great nation, of the state and local and federal levels, I think it's important that the Voting Rights Act is significant because it allows everyone's voice to be heard in this great democracy. Everything we do is affected by government, whether that's the city government, education laws by boards of education, state law, and federal law. Everything we do is, and so in this representative government, your representation is determined by your vote. And when you choose not to vote, that's a vote. You're voting for other people to decide your fate, and that's a vote. So I just want, as the representative of America's Civil Rights District, for us all to realize that the vote is precious. As John Lewis would say, it's almost sacred. And we as Americans, when we get to be 18 years old, we must register to vote, and we must vote in every election, state, local, state, and federal. We must vote in every election. To honor the legacy of those foot soldiers, those folks that marched, that prayed, some died for the equal right of all Americans to vote. So we owe it to them to vote in every single election, local, state, and federal. In conclusion, I just want everyone to know that it's not only important that we get into good trouble, as John Lewis would say, but I also want you to remember the words of John Lewis that last time that he was on the bridge. John Lewis, with his body stricken with cancer, went on the bridge one last time. And they gave him a microphone, and his voice was strong. He reminded us to never give up, never give in, to keep the faith, and to keep our eyes on the prize.
And what I would say more than anything at this moment, I know there are a lot of existential threats of all different types around, but we get the government that we show up and demand. And one way that we all know that we can demand, the thing that really that March Across the Bridge was all about, was our ability to demand that through the vote. John Lewis used to talk about voting as sort of a prayer. It was almost sacred. It is a hope and an aspiration that we as individuals all can speak to our consciences, our sense of moral selves, to say, this is what we think the right answer is for where government should go, and these are the people who should lead it. When we don't choose to exercise that power, we give away some of our autonomy. And when enough of us do, when enough of us don't, that is, show up and speak out, what we leave our government to are people who may not have our interests in mind. I'd like to talk of it myself as a choir rehearsal. If we're not showing up and singing our part, the song is always going to be incomplete. And the question for us in this moment is what each of us will do in committing ourselves to making sure that that commitment that the people who marched across that bridge made in 1965, at great risk to self, what is our commitment to make sure that that right is going to continue, not just for us, but for our kids, our nieces, our nephews, all the people that we hold dear in America that we hope will endure?
I think unfortunately we're going to continue to be in the circumstance that we find ourselves in right now, and that it's going to lead to a lot of legal challenges, a lot of protests, a lot of pushback against efforts to redraw district lines in ways that do not give adequate representation to communities and different groups of people across this country. And so that's something that we have to continue to stand up for, something that the people of Alabama, the plaintiffs in the case that ultimately led to my district, something that they stood up for, and something that people have been standing up for for decades. And so something that I'm incredibly grateful for and proud to be a part of.
In this current political climate, the challenges are significant, and the fight continues, almost to a point of making it feel like that fight is anew. Again, we have voter suppression laws on the books. We have various state legislators who are seeking to undermine the legally drawn districts that would properly represent whole communities, to include what happened here in the state of Alabama. With this forward push that's fairly blatant to gerrymandered districts in favor of the Republican Party, creating these super majorities across the country. This is a very much a forward push. And a part of the problem is that there is a dwindling demographic voting on the other side of the aisle. There is the need for this party to do the job of reaching out to voters, to attract potential voters to the party, but their ideals are archaic and very much, in most instances, reduced to, from xenophobia to, sexism, racism, you name it, every ism possible. And so we got real problems in our country right now, and not the least of which is ultimately to decide if we are going to have a democracy, period. And so I do think this is an incredibly powerful time. It is in my view, a flex moment, if ever there's one, regarding where we're going to be, what we're going to do, who we're going to be as a country is up for every aspect of consideration we can offer it. And it's going to be important that people remain conscious in these moments and aware of what it is that's occurring, because we really genuinely are at a very important flux moment in the life of the country. And like nothing my generation and certainly those generations after me have seen. We have read about it in our history books, but this one definitely mimics what was occurring in this country prior to Reconstruction. It really is, in my view, that climate is felt. And so legislation like the Voting Rights Act, I like to say, one of the things I say often, certainly colleagues of mine in the legislature here have heard me say this repeatedly, that my mother has said to me, said, look, I thought we fought those battles already. And said, I know you would have, battles to fight, but they'd be new battles. Unfortunately, we have come right back to what it is, as she is saying, we've already fought.
The National Center, which is world-renowned, really, when you think about voting rights and you think about all of the struggles that took place to even gain the right to vote, all of those treasures are right here at Alabama State University, and people come from miles and miles around to research, to look at the various documents that really speak to how the legislation came about, but also the importance of the legislation and what contributions it has made to this free democratic society.
We extend our sincere thanks to our esteemed presenters and members of our administration who have made this program possible. It is our hope that this program leaves you inspired and with a renewed commitment to the struggle for voting rights. Let us march on till victory is won. Thank you.